Hi, it's Emily, Kidlit Book Love. I'm here to talk to you today about a wonderful tale and novel by George MacDonald, The Princess and Curdie. And you may have seen one of my earlier videos where I talked about The Princess and the Goblin, which was the first book, which was this one. This one is re-released as another, in the Puffin Classics version. Obviously, this is a modern version. It's not vintage. And I did a full review on The Princess and the Goblin, which came 11 years earlier than The Princess and Curdie. The Princess and Curdie came in 1883, 11 years after The Princess and the Goblin. And Curdie was a boy character in The Princess and the Goblin. And he was sort of the Princess Irene's hero. And he appears here in his own book as sort of a follow-up tale a little bit later. Now, this is my 1908 vintage copy. The first edition, not of the Tale of the Princess and Curdie, which obviously, this came a good, 22 years later or whatever. But George MacDonald passed away not long before this version was made. And the publishers decided they wanted a more handsomer version of his book with nice and new illustrations, since it was so popular back in the 1880s when it first was released. So they came up with this edition in 1908, The Princess and Curdie. And it does have some full plates and illustrations. It's really very beautiful. I'm going to show you some interior pages here by George MacDonald with 12 illustrations in color by Maria L. Kirk by Philadelphia and London Company. Actually it says J.P. Lippincott Company, Philadelphia, London. Okay, that's the full title. And it has a list of all the illustrations, a list of the plates, and there's a little illustration at the beginning of each little chapter in this book. I found this book on eBay, so I have not found a very convenient modern copy of this on Amazon or anywhere else. Not a very good one, or one that was true to the form. So I purchased this vintage one. You can probably find an old vintage copy of it, not too expensive, somewhere. This one was about $30 because it was in such good shape. So I'm going to compare this to The Princess and the Goblin in a minute so you can see. I felt like this one took me quite a bit longer to read. The Princess and the Goblin, the first book, was much better in my opinion. Easier to read, more fantasy and flowing. But when I think about it, this was a Puffin Classics. This one here is a Puffin Classics version, modern, introduced by Ursula Le Guin. And I'm wondering, since it's technically meant to be children's literature, I'm wondering if this version, which is the only version I've read, I'm wondering if it was tailored down a little bit, the complexity of how it's written to be more user-friendly to kids. Because when I read this version, this original modern version, for the time, not for now, but it was far more complicated to read. There were a lot of words even I didn't know as a literature major. There were complicated paragraphs, whole page full of one sentence. That's a whole page. A very Victorian reading, kind of, a lot of sort of Dickens style, maybe a little bit more complicated than that. So two things I have to say about that. One is the children back during this time were genius to be able to read like this, because our modern child or middle schooler probably would have an impossible time and be so bored reading this. Even a high schooler would have a difficult time. To me, this original version felt like adult reading. This version, I would say easily a late elementary school and on could easily read, which makes me think it's edited. So I'm going to have to find a vintage copy of The Princess and the Goblin to read it, an unedited version, to see and compare. Then I'll know for sure. But The Princess and Curdie had similar gothic dark elements. It wasn't the same as with the underground monsters and goblins that were in the first book. But in this book, there were creatures, sort of grotesque, ugly-looking creatures that maybe were once animals that were transformed that come and help Curdie and the princess and her king father. But they seem very the grotesque, the way they're described. And of course we have the traditional castles and the moors and the princesses, and he's the princess's hero, and he sees the old woman. The plot is that at the end of The Princess and the Goblin, Irene left with her father the king when the land turned to waste after the goblins were wiped out, I guess you could say. So he actually ends up going to the original castle, I think it was, where she lived, to the tower, and comes across the old woman that says she's Irene's grandmother, who he didn't believe existed before, because Irene always said, I see her, but no one else saw her except for Irene. So he sees this grandmother who sends him on a mission, who's like a beautiful princess, goddess, in an old woman form, I guess, on this mission to do these things and go to this journey and go to this place and end up in this castle. And he didn't know he was going to find the king or Irene there, but he does when he gets there, and he discovers that Irene's father, and she's a princess, her father is ill, almost dying in bed, and he discovers quite quickly that he's being poisoned through wine and food to be killed off by the ministers and the people that want to take over his politics and his land. So Curdie, of course, once again rescues Irene and rescues the king, and they come to this great plot to deflect the food and the wine and switch it out, and so it's a really nice, cute tale. I liked it. And on his adventures on the way to getting to the castle where he discovers Irene and is reunited with her, she's a few years older, he has some adventures and things on the way. The book ends very kind of morbid and melancholic, though. I was very surprised. The ending, the ending says that the king dies eventually, and Irene and Curdie are married, but they have no children. So when they both die, that the land sort of title some random person to be the king, and that person let the land go to squalor and filth and darkness. It reminded me a lot of Noah's Ark a little bit, with a little biblical tie in there with all the bad people came in and got wiped out, and that was part of the plot and problem when the king was alive too. But the end, one day at noon, when life was at its highest, the whole city fell with a roaring crash. The cries of men and the shrieks of women went up with its dust, and then there was a great silence. So all the men and women of the city surrounding the castle all got crushed, apparently. Where the mighty rock once towered, crowded with homes and crowned with a palace, now rushes and raves a stone-obstructed rapid of the river. All around spreads a wilderness of wild deer, and the very name of Gwynstorm was seized from the lips of men forever. So basically the entire town, because it got taken over after Irene and Curdie died by this bad king, and everyone was selfish and greedy, and they got what was coming to them, basically, and the whole town got wiped out forever. No one ever heard of the town or the people again. So it's that was actually the very last paragraph. So it was a little bit, of a not a happy ending. And, if the whole princess and Curdie got married, there was like one sentence. There was no showing it. There was no getting into it. So definitely George MacDonald, The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie. Definitely this book is far better for me as an adult reader. I'm sure for any child. If you really like classic literature, you like the old stuff, you like the Victorian stuff, and you really like this book, read this just for the heck of it and see what I mean about the comparisons and what you think of it. This one was more of a challenge to read, of course. It could be because it was an original version, and still very charming. I mean, magical, the whole sort of fairy tale theme. So, it is a beautiful book. I really got lucky with this beautiful copy of this book for how old it is. And so it does go in my vintage book collection, and I have lots of vintage books. So George MacDonald, read The Princess and Curdie. If you haven't read The Princess and the Goblin, read that first and tell me what you think about both. Thanks for watching. And you can see my review of The Princess and the Goblin elsewhere on my channel. Thanks.